Okay, so let's start out with the definition of community solar. And this is put out by the Solar Energy Industries Association, which is probably the largest private organization in the solar industry. SEIA, they've taken some flack from the install community in years past because they were somewhat supportive of the import tariff on solar panels, which makes solar more expensive. On the other hand, everyone loves SEIA right now in the solar industry because they were instrumental in helping get the solar tax credit extended from 2016 out to 2023 as part of the 2016 budget bill, which extended fossil fuel expansion projects domestically and internationally, as well as expanded renewables. So let's get into the definition. Community solar is any shared renewable energy arrangement which allows multiple customers to combine investments to provide renewable power and or financial benefit from one local power plant. And the key word here is this and or right here. You know, what we're saying is community solar, you can share the renewable power. You know, it's all going into the grid. You're helping improve your local environmental grid quality. You know, when you do a wind power project, you know, that might improve environmental grid quality out where the wind turbine is, but that might be 800 miles away from your customer. So doing local renewable projects is important to have a local impact on your grid quality. That would be sharing the renewable power. But then we have this and or term separating the power from the financial benefit. And I think that's going to be pretty telling when we get into renewable energy policy, that the financial benefits of community solar are not for the consumer. You know, community solar is marketed as a method for cost savings for the consumer and the way to enfranchise renters and people with shaded rooftops so that they can contribute to the renewable revolution voluntarily through green power purchasing. The problem is that, and we'll see how there are silver linings to this problem, but by and large, community solar does not provide a financial benefit like a investment in the stock market would. In pretty much every case out there, solar ownership is always going to be more cost effective than community solar, and solar ownership payback really isn't where the industry needs it to be for this to fly off the shelf. So community solar generally has a worse payback than solar ownership, but the reason why it still attracts participants is because the upfront costs are not as heavy as solar ownership. You know, when you buy a solar array, even at the residential level, you know, you really need at least $15,000, if not more. And some community solar programs, you know, the financial commitment might be as little as $5 or $10 a year that you'll never see again. And so, you know, there's a lot of people out there who will add $5 or $10 to their electric bill to support local solar and not expect a financial return. That said, people who are looking for community solar to provide a financial return, consumers may be disappointed. So the question becomes, well, who gets the financial benefits of a community solar project? And the answer is, well, the developer and the utility. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if right now utilities are kind of anti-solar because they see it as something that cannibalizes their revenue. But if there's a business model available where they can profit off of solar power, it's not like the utility wants to cause climate change and global warming. If they could transition to renewables in a cost-effective manner, you know, they'll absolutely give it due diligence and consideration. And so, you know, really the economic motivators for community solar are coming from the developer and coming from the utility. So it's important to understand how to develop a community solar program. It becomes complicated because electric policy throughout the entire United States is a patchwork quilt. You know, the Commerce Clause, and it's kind of an inherent clause in our Constitution. It's not explicitly spelled out, but legal experts will reference the Commerce Clause, and what the Commerce Clause basically says is that the federal government will regulate things within the states that they regulate outside of the state. So things like import tariffs, for example. But things that are not international issues are left to the states to govern. Now, we have checks and balances and creep, and this is just a high-level statement here. But what it means is that the hard price of electricity and all of the electric policies that drive your electric bill are set at the state level. At the State Public Utility Commission, there's public input involved. But what that means is every state has its own electric policies, and so every state's community solar policies are going to be very different. And so the actual shape of the project and how people buy into the community solar project varies from state to state. So this article by Green Tech Media, it's a great green tech news resource if you're unfamiliar with them. There was articles comparing community solar and barbecue, just like you have Texas barbecue and Carolina barbecue. They're different, fundamentally different. Your community solar program in New York is fundamentally different than your community solar in Minnesota. Let's keep going. There's a couple of reports that we're going to cite in this program. This next one comes from National Renewable Energy Labs. NREL, one thing that they do incredibly well is publish lots and lots of 80, 90-page reports on green energy issues. I got into the solar industry not just from my oil company's internal report on solar, but also because NREL gave a great report called Rooftop Solar Photovoltaic Market Penetration Scenario. This was back in 2008, and it was all about how solar power is going to come to rooftop markets over the next years to come. It's very useful for understanding concepts and trends. So, a lot of this discussion comes from this larger document, which I've linked for your further research. You can have community solar friendly legislation versus no community solar legislation. Friendly legislation might be virtual net metering, where you can have the array at one location and any net metered credits that go out onto the grid, normally they would be applied to your specific electrical account. Virtual net metering allows you to apply those credits to others who are still connected to your local electric grid. So that's going to vary state to state. Virtual net metering is more popular on the Northeast coast, perhaps because they have a more congested electric grid. So they're more likely to pass friendly legislation for on-site power generation. If they're going to pay for that electricity, they'd rather pay for it being generated on site rather than imported in from other states. But when you look at the number of community solar projects in various states, while most community solar is policy driven through virtual net metering or state-specific community solar programs, you can do community solar absent these state policies and regulations as well. For instance, Texas is a deregulated electric grid. And that might mean that it's very hard to pass a policy like net metering. Texas has no statewide net metering policy. On the other hand, because it's a deregulated grid, you can build a power plant, connect it to the grid, and sell the electricity without too much obstruction in the way. Now, you have to pay transmission and distribution fees, but it's not a regulated grid where the utility has control over what power comes online. So in Texas, you could build a solar array and sell its electricity to others, but you need to have buyers for it. How do you get those buyers? That's what community solar is for. When we go into the case studies and we look at Minnesota's program, what we'll see is that to fund these community solar projects, they need to find buyers to offload that electricity at that premium rate. So the state authorizes a premium priced solar feed-in rate for solar projects, and for community solar to come out of the ground, it's not just that they have that rate structure available, it's that they find subscribers who are willing to fund or finance that rate, to say, hey, if you're paying a 2-cent premium on your electricity for solar that's imported into the grid, I'll buy that electricity at that 2-cent premium. And that way the community solar project does not raise costs on non-participants. The smaller part of that discussion is that utilities right now are very uncertain about how solar, and while they're not thinking about it right now, they're going to be screaming about it in 3 or 4 years, about how batteries too are driving down utility revenue. Solar right now, rooftop solar in the United States is about 1% of our grid, and that only to date reflects a 1% loss in utility revenue, perhaps a little bit less than that. But it went from 0.1% to 1% over the last decade. And over the next decade, it could easily go from 1% to 10%. So now we're starting to talk about projected losses that are very real. At the same time, you have batteries coming into play, and as we talked about in our battery management system class, batteries can eliminate half of the demand charges on your electric bill, which is half of a commercial electric bill. And so if utilities see 10% of their residential revenue drop offline because of solar, and they see 25% of their commercial revenue drop offline because of battery load leveling, so all of a sudden they're going to say, well, maybe the idea of signing up customers to 20-year purchasing contracts at a retail price equivalent with an escalator, maybe that's not a bad idea. Maybe we need to start securing our customers for the long term. On a deregulated grid, that's awesome because you have customer choice. You can buy your electricity from anyone, so locking down your customer for 20 years is a huge selling point. If you're a regulated grid, you might do community solar for other reasons. You might do community solar because, well, if you can lock down a customer for 20 years, if you get deregulated, that's great. But also you might do community solar to avoid deregulatory proceedings. Consumers want renewables, and so, if a utility has an anti-solar stance and then does not do community solar, they're really setting themselves up for a fight. If a utility has an anti-consumer solar policy, if they have a community solar program, they can point to it that says, we don't do solar this way, we do solar this other way. And that might placate some of the environmentalists, at least for a few years. But we can see that there is a correlation between state-driven community solar policy and participation of those states. So we see, just for example, on this little timeline here, let me get my pen here. We have Washington passing legislation, and then Washington doing projects over the next few years to come. Then we have Massachusetts passing legislation, and then a few years later we see Massachusetts doing community solar projects. Same thing with Maine. We got the legislation passed, and then it takes a few years for the project to come out of the ground. So by and large, your community solar projects do follow state policy, although there are examples of community solar projects coming online in states that lack policy. For instance, in Colorado, you got some community solar projects coming online before state policy is passed. Maybe that's a good idea so that these players who are into the market first have greater impact when that policy is being formed. And community solar is also a little bit of an industry buzzword too. And the reason why is back in 2015 and even into early 2016, we weren't certain if the solar tax credit was going to expire. In fact, many people were essentially planning on the solar tax credit to expire and focusing on kind of the silver linings of that. In other classes, we talk about how one negative downside to solar subsidies is that they can inflate your project cost, and that if you remove your subsidies, people are forced to make true cost-based design decisions, and that lowers your total system cost, although maybe not the out-of-pocket expense to the subsidized customer. Well, the tax credit was supposed to expire at the end of 2016, and what we can see here is this report was made in 2015 when they thought the tax credit would expire. And so we see on-site solar ramping up in 2013, 2014, 2015, and then kind of achieving a critical mass where the 30% tax credit expires in 2016, and maybe solar costs between 2016 and 2017 fall by 10 or 15%, but it's still more expensive. So the market shrinks slightly and kind of maintains its 2016 levels over the next few years to come. Well, what was projected to take its place to say, okay, well, if rooftop solar is not getting any more cost effective, what is getting more cost effective is utility generation. And we had an unexpected election surprise in 2017, for better or worse. But at the time, if we get in our time machine, go back to 2015, 2016, what they were looking at is the EPA Clean Power Plan driving utility scale investment in renewables. And one way to make a utility scale solar project more profit is to add a community solar layer to it. And so community solar in 2015 and 2016 was looked at as the solution to the tax credit expiring. We want solar to keep growing. We want to increase solar participation. While residential values are going to stagnate, community solar cost effectiveness and participation is going to grow. Well, that didn't happen. The tax credit was extended, and honestly, I'm not sure if this graph is completely true, because the utility scale sector certainly enjoys more total subsidy dollars than the residential sector or the commercial sector. So the utility scale solar is still reliant on subsidies as well. It's hard to get 4 or 5 cent power generation contracts to work without subsidies. So this is just to indicate the industry line of thinking in 2015 and 2016 that said community solar is going to be a very big deal very soon, perhaps rivaling the amount of rooftop solar in the United States. We've had a fundamental change to that in 2017. The EPA Clean Power Plan is now off the books, and the tax credit is on the books. So, you know, who knows what this will be in the years to come. There's also what community solar is not. And so there's green power purchasing, where you sign up for your utility's green choice plan. There's, you know, community purchasing, where, you know, like the Solarize Your City movement, Solarize Maine, Solarize Austin, Solarize Sacramento. There's this Solarize movement that says, let's get multiple members of the community to all buy their solar array at once and go through a single contractor. Now, that involves community involvement, community engagement. It's not necessarily community solar. Then there's solar bond purchasing. There's a few companies, Mosaic, Solar City from time to time, that have offered bonds in their company for solar financing. You know, so they market it as, well, you're helping solar come online by providing the financing, but you're not really involved in solar ownership. You get a return on your bond rather than a return on project revenue. And so that's traditionally not considered community solar, although we're going to talk about a community solar product that's very similar to that over the slides to come. And then, of course, there's direct array ownership or solar leasing as other paths to solar ownership. You know, what we'll see is direct solar array ownership is the most cost-effective route. Community solar participation and leasing often have similar kind of values, but there's less risk involved in community solar products. So yeah, I really see community solar as something that competes with your voluntary green power purchasing and also customers who would do solar leases, but not really a threat to direct solar array ownership. Even with net metering on you know, on the ropes, there's a lot of ways we can be smarter about solar design so that we don't export as much power onto the grid, and so net metering should become less important over time. Direct ownership, you know, retail price generation, consuming it on site with no transmission or distribution costs involved, you know, that's always going to be the most cost-effective application for solar. Yes, you can achieve economies of scale when you do a utility scale solar project, but that utility scale solar project will generate at, you know, something near avoided cost or near wholesale cost, whereas direct ownership is retail.